Pacific greetings, everyone. We are extremely delighted to have you here with us today. My name is Zahir, and I will be a host for this webinar. And our topic, as you all know, is reopening borders for tourism in the Pacific. But before we begin with the program, I'd just like to take you through the program today. So first of all, we'll have a welcome address by the CEO of Pacific Tourism Organization, Mr. Christopher Coker. After which our guest speakers will have the floor. We will then have a Q&A session at the end of the program after both of our speakers have presented. We'll try our best to answer as many questions as we can, within the 1 hour time frame that we have. But if you still have questions that you want us to answer, please send us your questions, and please feel free to use the chat room as well, and we'll do our best to answer your queries and your questions. Well, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure in inviting the CEO of Pacific Tourism Organization, Mr. Christopher Coker, to deliver his welcome address. Mr. Coker, you have the floor.
Thank you, Zahir, and ladies and gentlemen, warm Pacific greetings to all our listeners all around the world. It's good to see so many representatives from the 4 corners of this world who have joined us today on Zoom, and also to those who are watching us live on Facebook. Welcome to SPTO's monthly webinar series, where we share with you insights and learning on travel and tourism from within the Pacific region and around the world. Through these monthly webinars, we are hoping that we will help stakeholders in the tourism sector prepare well for recovery. The closing of the borders in the Pacific as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic has widely affected tourism in the region, resulting in massive job losses and an economic downturn. The stress of this border closure has been even more serious for those countries that are highly dependent on tourism, such as Cook Islands, French Polynesia, Fiji, etc. With the rollout of vaccines in the Pacific, there is now a level of optimism that tourism is resilient and will bounce back. Like we say, at the end of a tunnel, there's always a ray of light of hope. Ladies and gentlemen, today's webinar is a special one. As you already know, our discussion today will be based on the experiences related to border reopening of 2 of SPTO's member countries. We believe that it will provide a very good learning platform for other Pacific Island countries, as well as tourism stakeholders who may be in their planning stages for border reopening. It is my pleasure to welcome and thank our guest speakers for today. Our first speaker is the Chief Executive Officer of Cook Islands Tourism Corporation, Mr. Halato Afua, and our second speaker is the Senior Advisor of the Ministry of Tourism and Labour in charge of international transportation and institutional relations, French Polynesia, Mr. Hiranui Johnson. Kia ora, Halato, and welcome. Over to you. Thank you.
Sorry, Halato, you're on mute.
Apologies for that. Warm kia ora from the Cook Islands, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with you all this afternoon or this morning. And we would like to pass on our sincere regards from the Cook Islands as we stand in solidarity with our member countries during this time of COVID-19. And we do hope that we can all work together to try and tackle this pandemic and providing the economic development that we deserve as people of the Pacific. My presentation today will be based on the experience of the Cook Islands during COVID-19. And may I just ask Zahir if you can just put up the slides here, just very brief slides. The topic is very brief. So what I've done for this particular webinar is that I've just put a few slides to prompt me rather than discussing the whole concept of what we're doing at this stage. We're going to stick to some Q&A that has been provided by SPTO that we can provide some more targeted response for our member countries to in our audience. So in the first slide, we discuss the first question that we have is how successful is the border opening and is the demand and flight capacity? The one-way quarantine-free travel between the Cook Islands and New Zealand started in January 2021. So this is just opening our borders for Cook Islanders to go into New Zealand without the need to be quarantined. We weren't able to have the two-way quarantine-free travel until the 17th of May this year, where New Zealand visitors were able to travel to the Cook Islands without the need to be quarantined on site. We're very fortunate that we have opened to New Zealand as a key source market, and New Zealand has been one of the best countries to have tackled COVID-19 globally through an elimination strategy and prioritizing of the health of its citizens. The visitor arrivals that we've had since we've opened, the first full month is the month of June, where we've welcomed 6,054 visitors. We're projecting that in July, we will look at 12,000 visitors in July and 11,000 August, September, and October. The air capacity on international visitor arrivals is now up to about 65% of pre-COVID times. And so the pent-up demand is significant. And it's not only significant from the sense that it's we're the only Pacific country that's open to New Zealand on a quarantine-free travel arrangement, but we're also able to maximize our marketing presence in New Zealand as a key driver to keep the momentum for demand of Cook Islands holidays. Some of the changes we've seen in consumer behavior during this time is that a lot of the passengers or visitors are seeing the air and accommodation credits as free money. And so they're using that to leverage more high-end travel, that they're able to travel to the outer islands. Here in the Cook Islands, there's more demand to travel to Aitutaki from the New Zealand market that we haven't seen pre-COVID-19. The visitors are booking a much shorter booking window to travel. The average booking window to the Cook Islands is about 90 days. We're now seeing people booking this week to travel here next week. There's also a fear of catching COVID-19 in the airport or on the aircraft, more so than while at the destination. There's also fear of getting stuck overseas and having quarantine or missing work, paying for quarantine. And there's also a lack of insurance cover for these sort of scenarios. So it's still we're still managing a situation where we have travel alert levels that we can easily shift if there's any case or any cluster of COVID-19 cases here in the Cook Islands or in New Zealand, that we're able to shift our travel alerts to a more restrictive scenario. We're also seeing that the over 60s and at-risk people are more hesitant to travel until they are fully vaccinated of the 2 dosages. The second question is, what were some of the challenges we have faced during this time? I think that what we have to acknowledge is that we are entering uncharted territory. The COVID-19 pandemic was completely unplanned. It is a true test of our resilience of our people and the ability of our governments to mobilize the efforts and guide our community along the way. Some of the key challenges we've faced during this time is firstly on the economic hardship. Here in the Cook Islands, when the borders closed last year, our Ministry of Finance pivoted the situation where we used our stabilization fund from the proceeds we had in tourism in the last 10 years to support our private sector, businesses and employment through an economic recovery plan. So the government has spent over 100 million New Zealand dollars on recovering or hibernating the private sector during this time. Significant support given our population is about 17,000. Another key challenge for us is establishing health response and protocols. Overnight, there was a need for us to establish standard operating procedures that are specific for COVID-19. There had to be SOPs on ill traveler protocol, quarantine. There was a need for us to establish surveillance and testing where the PCR lab was mandatory for us to open our borders. We must have that to enable mass testing if required. Contact tracing mechanism was a must for us to ensure that the health response is intact when we get into a situation where we have to contact trace our population. The importance of health also means that we have to fine-tune our standard operating procedures to tailor for any scenarios where we have a lockdown. There's a need for us to repatriate visitors back to their home country, in this case in New Zealand, or shelter in place SOP. So establishing the health response was a critical component for us to enable our borders to open safely to New Zealand. We also needed to establish border SOPs in regards to not just air border, but also a maritime border. For the Cook Islands, we're completely closed to any other country, with the exception of New Zealand, both our maritime and our air border. And for us to operationalize that policy, we needed to develop operating procedures to ensure that we're able to make these protocols as practical as we can be. Another challenge that we have was the communication. During COVID-19, communication is key because it's a time of uncertainty, and we needed to give that confidence to the public. And I'll talk more about what are some of the strategies that we implemented from a communication point of view. The third question is, how did your department support government's efforts? As soon as our borders closed in March 2020, a government task force spearheaded by the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister and key government heads of ministries was activated immediately. The task force was prioritized on the social sector, so this comprised of health, education, and social services, on the economic sector, which was finance and tourism, and also our central agencies, which is Crown Law for regulation, as well as the Prime Minister's Office for messaging. Immediate priority was on the health of the population when we started the pandemic last year. In July 2020, as the health pandemic started to stabilize in New Zealand and Australia, a border easement task force was appointed to start the work on border opening to New Zealand without the need to quarantine on either side. This border easement task force was, the key members was the Ministry of Health, Foreign Affairs and Immigration, Ministry of Finance, Office of the Prime Minister, as well as tourism. For tourism to have a seat was very important for us because we are a key component of the recovery strategy. And as a national tourism organization, you have to repurpose your team during COVID-19. You have to part marketing functions internationally and pivot as the communications hub for the whole of government. Our newly defined roles saw us become the communication and marketing division for the Ministry of Health, for the Ministry of Finance and Foreign Affairs, to ensure that we push out our messages to be consistent and to gain the trust and confidence of the public. You have to redirect all of your resources that you've spent in the last couple of years at the international markets and your source markets. You bring back those resources to utilize entry because that's where a lot of the communication needed to be established. So this work included content generation, establish a new COVID-19 website for the whole of government, manage all distribution of health, COVID-19 and vaccination rollouts, and economic content through print advertising, TV advertising, radio, social media management, graphic design, and the communications from the Prime Minister. The ultimate role of tourism was now focused on delivering effective message to all members of the public and to give them the confidence during these times of uncertainty. Just on the next slide, Zahir. How did you assist tourism operators in your country? During COVID-19, we had to pivot and repurpose our team. Fortunately for Cook Islands Tourism, we've invested in our marketing department heavily in the last years in increasing capacity on graphic design, communication, and social media management. So we were able to provide the industry with key updates on all the work that we're doing at a government level. The other component that was important for us as a National Tourism Office is ensure that you provide face-to-face updates with the whole of the industry. Since the pandemic started, we've had a industry forum, 4 industry forums. So the first one we had in February last year, just before the borders closed in March. It was an opportunity for us to connect the members of the industry with key government departments that needed to understand the financial requirements, connecting them with the banks in terms of the banking facilities required during the hibernation period, connecting them with utilities such as the power company to provide some sort of incentives during that time. So I think it was important to use your tourism network to connect all of your key stakeholders. The attendance was about over 200 attendees from the private sector. and it was a good opportunity for us to discuss the way forward. In July 2020, we launched our Cook Islands Promise. Our Cook Islands Promise was our initial response to COVID-19, providing some guidelines to the tourism industry on how they can respond to various scenarios of managing your guests, managing the public, those that were looking at targeting local, the local visitor market, what sort of physical distancing, health hygiene requirements that you can provide. We've also followed the Cook Islands Promise with the Kia Orana Plus, which is a training module. So that training module we've established to provide further guidelines in depth in terms of hygiene, health protocols, financial guidelines, as well as other areas that we believe is very important for COVID-19. In March this year, while our borders were still closed, there was a lot of call from the industry to seek updates on how the discussions with New Zealand was going. So we were able to attend a public forum with our industry and bring all of our heads of key ministries to provide an update directly from finance, from foreign affairs, as well as from health. It's very important to keep the sense of the industry during a time of border closure, and give them the ability to understand that there is a strategy to look at your first border opening. Since we've opened the border in May 2021 to New Zealand visitors, we've then returned back to the industry with another industry forum in June last month to provide our first progress report of a first full month's progress on June, and also the tourism outlook that we have for the next couple of months. So assisting the tourism industry is a critical component. The COVID-19 website gives us a portal for communication that we're able to give the industry, as well as creating awareness on the travelers. We distribute a lot of information on the travel alerts that we have to the industry so that people understand the measures that we have to taking place if we were to move to a travel alert, whether we have to suspend flights or we have to go into a lockdown. So it's important that we're transparent and clear so that the message is digested well by the industry and also the community. The question number 5 is, what countries have you opened to and which ones are next? At this stage, we are only open to New Zealand. Pre-COVID-19, New Zealand tutored about 67% of our visitor arrivals. And then we have 15% from Australia and the remaining 18% from the Northern Hemisphere, both North America and Europe. As we understand, all of our member countries have various market mix, source market mix, and that plays a key part in your strategy of which countries you will open to. And Hironui will talk about the French Polynesia's perspective, where they're more Northern Hemisphere, as opposed to the Cook Islands, who is more Southern Hemisphere focused. The next step for us is that we have alluded to the private sector and the tourism industry that we will be looking at Australia. So there has been government-to-government discussions on that inclusion in the Trans-Tasman bubble. And we understand the situation with Australia at the moment is currently being managed. And until such time it's stable, there will be more dialogue on the addition of Australia. For the Northern Hemisphere, we used to have non-stop access from Los Angeles to the Cook Islands. At this stage, we are monitoring Australia and New Zealand strategy in Northern Hemisphere, and also monitoring how they will evolve into vaccination requirements, which is still at early stages this year. Just on the next slide, Zahir, sorry. So the sixth question is, what COVID-19 protocols have you in place for all passengers? So for the Cook Islands, because we have established a travel corridor with New Zealand, the pre-departure requirements for us is that you have to be in New Zealand for the last 14 days. So we welcome New Zealand citizens, New Zealand visitors. If you are a non-New Zealand if you're a non-New Zealand citizen and you're in New Zealand, you can come to the Cook Islands as long as you have a permit to enter back New Zealand, and of course Cook Islanders. The corridor that we have is quarantine-free travel, meaning that there is no need to be quarantined when passengers arrive in the Cook Islands and also when passengers travel to New Zealand. There is no need for a COVID-19 test while we operate at an alert level 1. At an alert level 1, there are no cases or community transmission both in New Zealand and the Cook Islands. We have a set of protocols that we operate at alert level 1. And therefore there is no COVID-19 test required for us. We have to acknowledge that New Zealand has a very robust health response strategy, and we're able to benefit from that from a Cook Islands perspective. Part of the pre-departure, you complete a health declaration form, and there is random health screening at the airport, usually temperature checks, standard procedure for most airports right now. While on the aircraft during the flight, you have to wear your mask as mandatory during that flight, and you also complete the Cook Islands Health Declaration physical form upon arrival, and that's more of a form to check on your health status, any symptoms, and some COVID-19 history that you're able to declare for the officials' information. Upon arrival, the wearing a mask is mandatory. We also do random health screening here at the airport. And then on the island, it's operated as normal. We're on alert level 1, and we have a set of requirements they're able to download from our COVID-19 website. Upon departure to New Zealand, you have to complete the Ngau Maira, which is the New Zealand Health Declaration form. This is a mandatory health declaration form for anyone in New Zealand. And if you arrive in New Zealand, there is no quarantine. You're on the green lane flight, which is a separated lane from the red zone flights or flights from countries that you have to enter quarantine in New Zealand. The next question is, are unvaccinated passengers allowed to travel to your country? The answer is yes. For us to have vaccination is not part of our pre-departure requirements, as long as you can demonstrate that you have been in New Zealand in the last 14 days and that you are a New Zealand citizen or permit holder, that you're able to enter New Zealand upon the end of your holiday. Number 8, is there a contact tracer app to monitor travel? Yes, we have, since COVID-19 started, we have established the CookSafe. So the CookSafe is a QR code that you can uplift from a few offices in the Cook Islands. So this QR code is that you can just fill in your form, you tear out the QR code, and then you can stick it on your phone or on a lanyard, and then you can use it. Most of the businesses here have got a QR scanner that you can scan when you arrive. We've also, the government has also established the CookSafe Plus. So the CookSafe Plus is our equivalent of the New Zealand Tracer app. This is the app that you can download, and it's more of a tracking mechanism as opposed to tracing. So it tracks wherever you go. So that's been very helpful for us. The government and the private sector is also working on the New Zealand Tracer app, which you can use in the Cook Islands. And so the steps that are taken now is to ensure that the interoperability of the New Zealand Tracer app and the CookSafe app is working effectively. Just on the last question for me is, what key messages you have for the audience? I talk as a small island state and as a national tourism office. I think the key takeaway for me that I can share is that the first thing that you have to make sure that your country has is a governance structure. There is a strong need. Tourism is not working in silos anymore. Pre-COVID-19, tourism was able to function as its own national tourism office, focusing on visitor and the tourism industry. During a COVID-19 period, you have to work closely with your health department, with your finance department, with your foreign affairs, immigration, customs, all those key departments. You have to make sure that the governance structure is in place. Having your cabinet arm appoint a task force that comprises of both your officials in all these key areas, so that there's a coherent and cohesive approach to COVID-19. Secondly is that the National Tourism Office needs to pivot during COVID-19. without any visitors on your island, national tourism officers should be pivoting and ensuring that you repurpose, you make use of the skills that you've developed in tourism to become a comms hub for your government. A lot of our government departments need that assistance with communications, and communication is one of the key strengths that you have in the National Tourism Office. You have the capacity. So the best thing you do is that you become a mini division of key departments focusing on health, border, as well as finances to push out a consistent message across governments. Thirdly is the significant investment in health and border readiness is so important. During the pandemic, it's very clear to us that the forefront of tackling this COVID-19 is the Ministry of Health. So the Ministry of Health needs a lot of assistance from the communication side. We've stepped in to run the vaccination rollout comms plan, as well as communicating on key health protocols and to ensure that you gain not just the confidence of the public and your citizens, but also the confidence of your bilateral partners that you're wanting to seek border opening with. The fourth key message is assessing your key source markets and engage at the government-to-government level. Every country in the Pacific is different in terms of your geopolitical status and which countries that you plan to open source markets. It's very, very important that you engage at the government-to-government level because this is no longer a unilateral sort of situation. There has to be either bilateral or multilateral that you're able to open up to various countries that aligns with your risk profile and your risk assessment of COVID-19. Number 5 for me is that we have to be realistic of our economic outlook and what the government can do to help your citizens during this period through an economic recovery plan, assistance to your private sector, both through employment, such as wage subsidy, business grants, low interest rate schemes, interest relief program. This is so important because the hibernation of the private sector is important during a period of pause. And just lastly for me is that the tourism industry has come across a lot of questions around how do we diversify the economy. And I know that the Cook Islands is on the more less diversified status in the Pacific. But I think it's brought a lot of discussions on how we can diversify as an economy. And that's something that we continue to engage. It's not a low-hanging fruit for us, but it's something that we need to look more broadly in the event that we have more pandemics or crises like this, that we're able to tackle it in a different light. So without any further ado, I'll end my discussion there, and then I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A section. Me taki mata.
Thank you so much, Mr. Halatoa, for the wonderful presentation. So if anyone has questions in particular on this particular session, we will discuss them once both the presenters are done. Alternatively, if you feel that you probably would forget later on, then please feel free to use the chat feature in Zoom and send us your questions, and we'll be sure to discuss those questions as we head into the Q&A session. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now hear from our next speaker, and it gives me immense pleasure in inviting Mr. Hironui Johnston, Senior Advisor of the Ministry of Tourism and Labour in charge of International Transportation and Institutional Relations of the Government of French Polynesia. Mr. Hironui Johnston, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahir. I hope you can hear me well. And thank you all for your presence today. It's our great pleasure to share with you our experiences. We were already invited last year as we reopened our borders on July 15th, 2020. And so for this presentation, I didn't know if I should compiled both presentations from last year until now, but I will ask Zahir to share the presentation. And it's just one slide, one idea, and I'm just going through it, and hopefully those answers the questions that were asked to us. And I don't want to call it the presentation, but the slideshow is a past, present, and future of the tourism here in French Polynesia. Slide number 2 is just a next slide. I don't know if you're still on that next slide or if my...
So do you want me to go to the previous one?
Slide number 2.
That
Okay.
one. Yeah.
So slide number 2. So just a reminder of all the steps that we went through for our reopenings, for the reopenings of our borders. So we went into lockdown March and June, like most of us in the region and in the world. Then we had the domestic reopening for tourism in June 2020 before the international reopening in July 2020. Then in February and April, from February to April 2021, we had a second closure of our borders because of the variant, and so we wanted to readapt and readjust our protocol and entry conditions. Then we were so most of our protocol can be summarized in 3 words: detect, track, and isolate. So the second reopening was gradual, and it started in May 2021. And the reopening, so to the difference to the Cook Islands, French Polynesia decided on another strategy, which is to fully reopen to everyone and see which countries, which markets will open to us. And so naturally the Western markets, Europe and the US, reopened to us, and the Asians and Pacific markets are still closed. And so the second reopening differentiated geographically. The protocols were different depending on the geographic market you were coming from. It was more open for the US because the vaccination rate was higher than in Europe. And so we have more restrictions for travelers coming from Europe. And then started in June 2021, the entry to French Polynesia was then based on sanitary status, vaccinated or non-vaccinated people. The non-vaccinated people were more, the restrictions were there were more restrictions for non-vaccinated people. Next slide, please. So the entry condition, the requirements for the vaccinated people was summarized in having a PCR or antigen test before arrival within 3 days, and fill out the ETIS form, which is online, and then a antigen test upon arrival, which was retested with a PCR technique. And for the non-vaccinated people, they had to prove of imperial motives, professional, family, or health, and also demonstrate that they had a quarantine site for their quarantine upon arrival. And in addition to the tests that were required for the vaccinated people, which are 3 days prior departure and upon arrival, the non-vaccinated people has additional tests at day 4 and day 8 after their arrival. Next slide. The testing procedure is, we are now asking a contribution to all travelers, resident and non-resident, to the testing protocol, which help us to detect people. And so for non-vaccinated people, it's 5,000 francs for 2 tests upon arrival, and the non-vaccinated people, they will have to pay 12,000 francs for 4 tests after their arrival. And so you can see the procedure. We also provide the service for travelers who travel to the US, service to access to PCR tests within 72 hours or antigen tests at the airport, except for Hawaii, with which we will resume flights starting August 7th. And Hawaii required PCR test only with a partner, which is the national lab, Institut Louis Malardi. And then we have a protocol for the isolation. We do differentiate the terms, quarantine being those who are not vaccinated, but don't have the symptoms or were not tested positive on the test. And isolation is for those who were detected positive. So both isolation and quarantine are for 10 days. Next slide. And so to track people, we use our, I won't call it an app, but we can call it, if you want, like that. So we use the ETIS, which help us identify the traveler and on which a traveler have to share their itinerary. The traveler can update their itinerary, and so it's easier, and contact information, which makes it easier for us to track them. This platform was really helpful to find all the travelers who were detected positive after the 4 days or upon arrival. Next slide. Just wanted to give you the sanitary and vaccination update in French Polynesia. So vaccination, we are at about 28% of the total population, and so 38% for 18 years old and older, 67% for 60 years old and older, and 73% for 75 years old and older. So we can see that the most, the population at risk, we have intensified the vaccination, and now we are, and we have created vaccination, pop-up vaccination center all around the island to encourage people to get vaccinated. Next slide. And so the current data for 2021, based on the ETIS registration. I don't have the next slide yet, so I can't really see the data. Okay. So we had from the 1st of January to the 23rd of July, almost 40,000 registration on ETIS, and as you can see, the non-resident part represents 72% of those registration. And so the share of those non-resident travelers, as you can see, mostly from the US, 53%, and then from France, 40%, and the rest of the world, about almost 8%. And as you can also see on the chart below that, so the distribution is mostly into islands which have hotels like Tahiti, Moorea, Bora Bora, Huahine, and Raiatea, and some other islands with hotels like Taha'a and Rangiroa. Next, please, which is the capacity evolutions. In terms of hotel capacity, since 2019, from 2019 to June 2021, we had a decrease in our hotel capacity. So we went from 46 hotels to 38 by June 2021. And we are slowly recovering from it. So by the end of this year, we have some hotel which will reopen, and so which will bring our capacity to, I don't see it yet, the next slide. Yeah, which will bring our capacity to almost 2,500 units, and with 42 hotels. And so we also monitored the increase of our general capacity with the new projects. So by 2023, before the Olympic in 2024, is French Polynesia is hosting the surf competition for the 2024 Olympics. Can you go back, please? Sorry. Zahir, can you go back?
To 7. Back more.
So it should be capacity evolution slide. Yes, that one. So we're also monitoring all the hotel projects until 2027, which we should have 53 hotels by then. And meanwhile, we'll also have other accommodation capacity. Is that the capacity evolution slide? The title of the slide is capacity evolution. I don't have the numbers.
No.
So we have other accommodation capacities, like the vacation rentals, or Airbnb, if you like to call them like that, and also the guest houses and the charter, which also represent almost the capacity of a big hotel, and also 3 cruise ship based in French Polynesia. We have some good projections of having new ships based and doing turnarounds in French Polynesia, which will add temporarily capacity to our destination. And so I have listed 4 new ships which might come to French Polynesia between normally by 2022, by next year. In terms of air capacity, so in 2019 we had 9 airlines operating 9 routes and operating about 28 to 30 weekly flights. 2021, only 4 airlines for 4 routes and operating 10 to 15 flights weekly. And by the end of 2021, we should have 5 airlines for 4 destinations operating 14 to 24 weekly flights. You can see on the chart below that so the green one is the 2019 total passenger traffic in Tahiti Fa'a. The blue purple one is the 2020 traffic, and the orange one is the 2021. As you can see, we have, let's say, we lost 50% of our traffic, mostly because the other markets, then the other routes are closed, like Japan, New Zealand, and South America, and the Cook Islands, because we have a weekly flight to Cook Island in 2019. So, and we only worked on our 2 main markets, representing 50 to 7% of our tourism arrival in French Polynesia. And so the government, last slide, the next slide, please. And so the government aid to tourism business. So in 2021, so we had two types of program to businesses and notably to save employment. So the first program accounted for 21 million US dollars, and it helped 7,000 employees of 399 businesses. So tourism and transport sector accounted for 90% of that amount, and which saved 6,000 employees in 212 businesses. The other program was accounted for 14 million dollars, and tourism and transport sector, which helped 586 employees in tourism and transport sector. In 2021, the first program, so the DIES, was budgeted at 52 million francs, the US dollar, and so which helped 6,096 employees in 193 businesses. And the second program, the CSE, 5 million USD, so helped 329 employees in tourism and transport sector. And I think that's all for the moment. We had also for the next step for us, which is to continue with our domestic tourism incentives called TTTIR, and developing the MICE niche as we are preparing for the Olympic Games in 2024, and also maintaining the NASA program, Sophia mission, which account for 150 or 160 people for about 3 months, and also an annual conference which will be organized here in French Polynesia, the Blue Climate Initiative, which also will account for about 100 people. And also the implementation of our new strategy, Farid Amanihini 2025. In terms of reopening borders with other countries, so Hawaii, after a year of negotiation and exchange, so we will reopen and resume flights with Hawaii next month. We have flights to New Zealand under the MIAC scheme, so it's mostly for merchandise and not for people, for passengers, and also repatriation, monthly flights to New Caledonia. We will engage into the negotiation with Canada and Japan in the coming months to start flights, or at least reopen borders with them. As key messages from a government position, it's the tourists are not the cause of the spread of the virus in French Polynesia. It's mostly from the residents. So we are heavily investing into raising awareness among the population to respect the health and sanitary protocol. In terms of governance, we are working closely with the High Commissioner of the French Republic and the President's Office and the Health Ministry, and also all the tourism actors to make sure that the reopening is going smoothly. As you have seen in the table, summarizing the sanitary situation in French Polynesia, the new cases that we have found were mostly among the local population. So that's where we want to focus our communication. And that's it for me. And I prefer to allow it for more discussion exchanges with others if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hiranui Johnston. We have now come to the Q&A session, and I'd like to open the floor for discussion. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask your questions and direct them to the guest speakers. Thank you. I have a question from Japan here. So the person says, now with Cook Islands and Tahiti opening their borders to tourists, what type of tourists are they seeing more of? Are they holidaymakers, or are they VFR, which is visiting friends and relatives? And were there any unforeseen issues that the two destinations had to deal with from the local community? So this question from Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahia. I can probably start on that. So I think it's a good question. What we've seen since the border opening is that there has been a change in the type of visitors we're getting. The only airline that's operating at the moment is Air New Zealand. We're seeing a lot of high-end sort of travelers coming on board. A lot of air and accommodation credits been used, and I think I've covered that in my presentation. And so the expectations are much higher for us to deliver, and we are facing a lot of labor shortage issue in the Cook Islands that we also have to manage the quality standards that we have. So that's probably the challenge for us, is how do we use our limited resources we have at this stage to cater for a high-end sort of travel that we have to meet those expectations. In terms of the public perception, there has been a lot of, we're dealing with frightened communities. A lot of our communities are frightened to get COVID-19. In the Cook Islands, we have 15 islands, so the rest of the other islands outside of Rarotonga are more risk adverse to opening the islands to have a connection to Rarotonga. But what we've done is that there has been a strong communication sort of call to get everyone on board, making sure that people are being educated in COVID-19 measures. And before the vaccination arrived here in the Cook Islands in May, when we opened the borders, there was a lot of reluctance to border opening, given that the population was not vaccinated. Since we've implemented the vaccination program in May, our 2 doses is now at about 95% of the population. So that has given a lot of confidence to the public in opening borders to international visitors. And given that we're only opening to New Zealand, the situation is more contained. It's more much less of a risk opening to other countries. So we're following New Zealand's elimination strategy on COVID-19, and that is how it's helping us to recover some of our economy through tourism during a restrictive sort of scenario. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Halatuafua. Any other questions?
If I may, so I can answer for French Polynesia. The shares and let me turn on my video, sorry. So VFR are mostly coming from, it's mostly the type of tourists or travelers that we have from the French market, as well French overseas collectivity, and being in the summer vacation period for the Western and North Hemisphere market. So we have a lot of VFR travelers from the French market and vacations from holidaymakers from the US market. And we are now seeing the return of family tourists and travelers. In terms of bookings, our partners on those markets have noted and underlined that they have bookings until 2022, the end of the first semester of 2022. And the calls are now has increased by, depending of the markets, from 300 to 400% compared to 2019. I've seen some questions on the chat box about vaccination. Vaccination is not mandatory in French Polynesia. And so we encourage people, and the only way we at the moment, the only way that we are using to encourage people is to add more restrictions on non-vaccinated people, like a quarantine, mandatory quarantine, 4 tests upon arrival, and all that. And we are slowly going to see how we can implement some measures that are implemented, that will be implemented in France, as the French President Macron has announced last week. And also thinking with the tourism office about more positive incentive for vaccination, like a draw for free hotel rooms or free meals or things like that for domestic, for residents. So those are the some action that we will implement to encourage vaccination.
Zahia,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt. There are questions from Jennifer and also Bill Keefe, as well as
Sure.
Captain Dietmar on the chat box.
Yeah, sure. So there's one here that I'd like to just ask first before I move on. So the question says, considering children are not vaccinated yet for many countries, and since both countries accept vaccinated and unvaccinated travelers, so how are hotels and tourism operators dealing with bookings in terms of capacity? Do they limit their booking capacity to create a social distance? Just give me a second. Distance space between guests, or were there any thoughts around this?
In French Polynesia, we're not limiting because our hotels are already, the infrastructure of our hotel are not like the hotels in Waikiki with one building and a lot of rooms in that building. We have individual bungalows which already allowed physical distanciation. And the hotels are just reorganizing their meal, their restaurant organization so some have implemented a reservation only, and those are just doing by different time frame, giving time frame for reservation, and others are just expanding into their terrace or outside to allow more people to eat in the restaurant, at the restaurant, and maintain social distanciation.
Thank you, Zahir. For the Cook Islands, in terms of children, because we accept vaccinated and non-vaccinated visitors at this stage, it's not really an issue for us. We are looking at the 12 to 15-year-old bracket, subject to MedSafe approval in New Zealand. So that's something that's on the horizon. In terms of restrictions, because we mirror New Zealand's alert levels, alert level 1 is operating almost as normal if there is no community transmission in either countries. So we do keep the awareness of staying home if you're sick, as well as hygiene, good hygiene, and other prevention measures. Track down where you're going in terms of your contact tracing. So we still maintain those messages. If we identify a community case in either New Zealand or the Cook Islands, we then move to an alert level 2. and that's when you start at the possibility of suspending flights within 48 hours. We might have some restrictions on negative COVID-19 tests before you travel to the Cook Islands, and then we limit the number of social gathering to a maximum of 100 people. If you move to alert level 3, if there is detected COVID-19 cases in both countries, or in the Cook Islands, then it's more restrictive. We can suspend flights up to 72 hours, and then we reduce the gathering down to from 100 to 10 people. If we move to alert level 4, which is basically a lockdown, that's when there's more than one case in the Cook Islands or New Zealand, or in the Cook Islands, sorry, or there's clusters, then we go into an intensive sort of lockdown. So the answer to the question is that at alert level 1, at the current situation, we're operating at normal sort of circumstances, but with the heightened awareness on COVID-19 measures.
Thank you. Another question here is, are the employees working in resorts hosting fully vaccinated guests themselves fully vaccinated, or are they just requesting guests to be fully vaccinated, basically? Are the workers fully vaccinated as well? I think that's the question.
Just quickly, for the Cook Islands, we're considering having a mandatory sort of requirement for frontline staff. But at the end, our Ministry of Health decided to keep it voluntary. It's a much cleaner sort of framework for us. And so at this stage, it's still a voluntary mechanism. It's not mandatory by law. And so it's not for you to be vaccinated if you're frontline staff.
Thank you.
The same in French Polynesia, it's not mandatory, and our hotel accepted non-vaccinated and vaccinated people. The non-vaccinated have to quarantine, of course, and we have people quarantine in their hotel room. And so for the staff, it's not mandatory for them to be vaccinated, but we encourage the government and their employers are encouraging them to get vaccinated. I forgot to answer the questions about the kids. The children for us fall under the health status of their parents if they're traveling with their parents. If they're not traveling with their parents, and not vaccinated, they go directly into quarantine at their house if the infrastructure of their house allows it to be isolated from the rest of the family.
Thank you, Hiranui. We've got a question here from Captain Petushnik. What are the expected dates for normalcy with regards to 70% vaccinations in your territories? We are organizing a yacht rally across the Pacific in 2022 with USA flagged and fully vaccinated vessels.
For French Polynesia, French Polynesia is as vast as Western Europe, is like 49% of the continental US. So we will welcome your rally in our waters, and 70%. That's the issue with the figures. It depends how you see it. Is it 70% of the entire population, 70% of the adult population, 70% by archipelagos? The main archipelagos, the main island is Tahiti, and all and also the main entrance to French Polynesia. Is it a requirement for 70% of the population of Tahiti? So that's the strategy that we have. For example, the islands of the archipelago of the Marquesas Archipelago are already at 70% of their population, adult population, vaccinated. So as I said, the total population vaccinated in French Polynesia is at, I'm sorry, we have 28% of the vaccinated people on the total population of French Polynesia. And if you only do account for the adult population, we have 43% of the population, of the adult population vaccinated.
Thank you, Hiranui. Any updates on the French Polynesian maritime borders?
We are, the thing is, the High Commissioner's office is busy with the official visit of the French president, who arrived in 2 days, 2 or 3 days. And so in terms of maritime border, we're going to have a meeting with the Maritime Affairs, the State Department tomorrow, and we have more perspective, of more idea of how we are going to reopen our borders. The based cruise ship can operate in French Polynesia, sailing super yachts and just yacht in general can come in French Polynesia, but they have upon a request, and each request will be instructed by the Maritime Affairs.
Thank you, Hiranui. So there's just another question for Hiranui. How has French Polynesia managed communicating health protocols to tourism businesses and ensuring that they comply?
Sorry, I got cut off a little bit. So in
no
other
problem.
words, we'll have more idea of the maritime borders reopening by tomorrow, and the French Polynesian government is working on the reopening before the end of this year.
Thank you, Hiranui. Just another question for you. How has French Polynesia managed communicating health protocols to tourism businesses and ensuring that they comply?
And so for those who attended the first webinar that we participated in last year, just like the Cook Islands, we have initiated last year for the reopening a training program, and also we have published a health protocol guidelines to all the businesses. French Polynesia's protocol was also recognized and awarded a Safe Travels stamp by the WTTC. We also have sanitary guides or stewards, depending how you want to call them, who are going. We have about 500 of them among all the implemented in all the islands with high tourism traffic. And so they go into tourism businesses, they go into public areas to remind people about the health protocols. So that's how we are. So we have already implemented training program and guidelines since last year. And in terms of monitoring it and see if they are complying with it, we have those sanitary stewards going into the islands and businesses to have reminders.
Thank you, Hiranui. So there's another question from Bill Keefe, and he's asking, has the June 2021 reopening of Tahiti been successful? Has the SOP of accepting only full vaccinated passengers successfully protected the people of Tahiti from COVID infections from international visitors? How has that played out basically for French Polynesia?
Really, to be frank with you guys, of course I think we had about 10. I detected 10 international travelers, non-resident travelers, positive at the test upon arrival. They were sent to isolation, they respected, and so they were not the cause of any spreading or clusters in French Polynesia. We had more difficulties with resident, because like in any countries, resident think that they think that they have the right to do whatever they want in their home country. And so we had more spread and clusters potential from resident than from non-resident. And that is based on our experience. Even if they are vaccinated, people can still have the virus. So far, the vaccination incentive for travelers, because they only have 2 tests to
Sorry, Hiranui, are you there? We may have lost. Cut off.
So far, the vaccination for international travelers has protected the population. We're still working on our local population.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answers your questions.
Yeah, I think it does. I just have one question, which I'd like to first direct at Halatoa, and then I'll give you an opportunity to answer the question as well. So this is from Tessa Tupo. So the question is, what are the safety measures and procedures that are put in place for accommodations, restaurants? Are employees in the tourism sector required to be fully vaccinated? As you've mentioned, the communities are at a frightened stage with the COVID-19 pandemic. And she says, I can imagine the reluctancy from the communities to open the border. What are the strategies you use to build the confidence of your people to be able to basically agree to open up your borders?
Yeah, thank you, Zahir and Tessa. For the safety measures and procedures, so the travel alerts that we have at alert level 1, 2, 3, and 4, what we're doing with the industry is that we're working on a more detailed procedures by segment of the market. So what does it mean for restaurants, food and beverage? What does it mean for a resort or a holiday home or a tour operator? So we're refining that to ensure that it's as practical as possible. So that's still work in progress. But what we have now is that we have a set of the alert levels that we provide, very general protocols that the industry can follow in their respective operations. The question on the employees in the tourism sector required to be fully vaccinated in the Cook Islands, it's still voluntary. It's not mandatory by law. And in terms of the community, the key turning point for the Cook Islands public confidence has been the vaccination program. Having a high vaccination uptake in the Cook Islands has given the public confidence. There has been a lot of questions from the public and various community groups before the vaccination started, but now that the population has been vaccinated over the 90% mark, that has given the public confidence with the tourism industry to proceed, given that we are only opening to New Zealand at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Halatoa. Hiranui?
Can we repeat the question, please? I was reading another questions and then
no problem. The question is actually right there in the chat room. By Tessa?
The thing is, because I got cut off, I lost all the chat.
Oh, okay. I can repeat that. What are the safety measures / procedures that are in place for accommodations and restaurants? Are employees in the tourism sector required to be fully vaccinated? As you've mentioned, the communities are at a frightened stage with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I can imagine the reluctancy from the communities to open the border. What are the strategies you use to build the confidence of your people to be able to agree to open up your borders?
all the procedures until
So here, just while Hiro's the connection, Hiro's still recovering, I'll just answer Francis Dominic's question
Sure.
on the communication. So the communication, I think the key to ensuring communication is a key part of what tourism can provide is to seek approval from the top. So having your Prime Minister and your cabinet endorse a task force, and that the National Tourism Office can provide that function. Here in the Cook Islands, we don't have a dedicated communications department that's shared as a part of every department. And so having that endorsed at the highest level of the executive order arm gives you the mandate to provide the communications. And of course, you have to deliver as an organization. You have to provide the quality of what you produce through comms, whether it's your social media management or your advertisements that you do. You have to provide value to earn the trust of your various government departments. Thank you.
Thank you, Matua. I think we can just do maybe 2 more questions, and the rest of them we will share with all the. We'll try to get them answered and as soon as possible. So one question that I've got here is from. Just give me a second, please.
Recording in progress.
Zahia, there's a
Yes.
question from Ironi.
Yes.
Puamau is particularly to Halatoa. Does hotel staff who look after non-vaccinated guests have to self-isolate as well? If so, for how long?
Sorry, Rodney. So, okay, do hotel staff who look after non-vaccinated guests have to self-isolate as well? Thanks, Ronnie. So here in the Cook Islands, the international visitors we get from New Zealand, vaccination is not mandatory. So most, because the New Zealand program is still ongoing, there's a lot of New Zealanders who have not been vaccinated. That is not a requirement for us as a pre-departure to arrive in the Cook Islands. So there's no requirements for hotel to self-isolate. The only time that staff here will self-isolate is if there is a suspected case and through contact tracing have been identified as a close contact, then you'll be asked to either self-isolate or quarantine. Or if you're a flight crew, so this is a standard protocol for airline crew that they, especially if they have been allocated to a flight outside of New Zealand and Australia, there's protocols that the airlines follow quite clearly in terms of regular testing, as well as a step-down period, whether it's 3 or 4 days, to allow for you to do a final test before you come back into the schedule. So that's the only time that we will see self-isolation here. We did have a period last year where the country, when we still closed our border, and we were still doing the whole quarantine, 14 days in the Cook Islands or 14 days in New Zealand. That's when we practiced the self-isolation and the quarantine. And what we use then is that each village in the Cook Islands have a committee, what we call the Puna. So they would partner with the Ministry of Health, and they would run a quarantine and a self-isolation process. For example, if you're self-isolated, you have a flag at your property, and that flag is colored red, for example. Red stands for self-isolation. No one's allowed to go there. That's a zoned area. And then the isolated people work with the punas or the village councils to provide food, shopping, or other necessities that you require. So that sort of process was during the time that we had to be quarantined, either coming from New Zealand or going into New Zealand. So that has been released. We're now operating at a quarantine-free travel arrangement.
Probably one final question for both of you from Mohammed Jamal. For travelers that are traveling to Cook Islands in French Polynesia, are most bookings directly from hotels, wholesaler agents, or OTA? Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think that's a very interesting question. What we've seen in the Cook Islands is that there has been an increase in direct bookings. A part of this is because of the credits. So a lot of people have booked air credits and they're booking airfares first and then looking at finding accommodation, so going directly. There has also been a trickle effect to the OTAs. So the OTAs are seeing a much quicker recovery in their business as it also associates with direct bookings. In the wholesale business, we're still seeing a gradual sort of climb in the wholesale business. What we do in New Zealand is that we run an integrated campaign where we both direct advertising as well as wholesale partner programs. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had an expo of trade and consumer show in New Zealand, which has been targeting both direct and wholesale business. So of the 3 sort of channels, direct, booking directly with the property website or your social media platform has increased. And then secondly is the OTAs has increased as well. And we're seeing a gradual sort of increase in the wholesale business. As we understand, some of the wholesalers have either prolonged or reduce the operations during COVID. There's a bit of time required for wholesalers to ramp up their efforts as well.
Thank you so much, Halatoa. Hiranui, would you like to answer?
So for French Polynesia, we had a good share of both. So both increased. So the numbers that we received were from our travel agent partners and TOs on the markets, and they have, like I gave data, they have noticed a 300 or to 400% increase from 2019 on the same period. The forward keys data showed a 115% increased bookings to the destination, the islands of Tahiti, French Polynesia, on the period July to September. Direct bookings also increased because we have a law in French Polynesia that facilitates reimbursement or postponement of your bookings if there's any issues related with COVID-19 restrictions. I wanted to share something. What we have noticed is mostly French Polynesia was booking to French Polynesia, notably from Europe, was about a year in advance, just like in the US, and we have noticed a lot of last-minute bookings, like 14 days booking period since the full reopening of our borders in June.
Thank you so much, Hiranui. And I think that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Special appreciation to our guest speakers, Mr. Halatoa Fua and Mr. Hiranui Johnson. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you so much to everyone who participated in today's webinar. Please note the webinar is recorded and it will be shared on our YouTube channel in our next Pulse newsletter. So stay tuned. And for those who did ask us questions, but we were not able to get back to you, we'll rest assured we will answer your questions and we'll send those questions to you. Thank you very much once again, everyone, for participating.